One thing that we've all experienced is feeling like our lives are falling apart at some point in time. And it can't be denied that Wendy Williams has really been going through it in the past several years. What I find interesting when I look at her birth chart and the transits and progressions to it is that she has been going through at least three of the most difficult periods of times that you can see in astrology. And I'm going to talk about those. The first one is having her progressed moon transiting her 12th house. She also has gone through a 12th house perfection year. And the 12th house is all about endings and isolation and even a lot of times being locked up in institutions. And the third one that I want to talk about is Saturn transiting her first house and her ascendant. Although she had had some troubles before this time in September of 2021, this is about when things seem to have first started for her. She had a positive COVID test on about September 15th, 2021. And one of the things that we can see going on here is that her progressed moon, that's on the outside ring there, was in her 11th house, but it was just about getting ready to conjunct with her progressed south node. And a lot of times when you have moon conjunct south node, you can come up with problems with health, also problems with home, and even sort of emotional coping because the moon has to do with emotion. You can also see that the progressed moon is square her progressed sun. And whenever we have a square, there can often be difficulties. So this is kind of a conflict between where she's going and sort of how she's going about getting there. And then the other thing that we see is that in that middle ring, Saturn is just in the beginning of starting to transit her first house. So for Wendy, because she has a night chart, she was born at nighttime, Saturn becomes the most difficult planet in her chart. And so we can expect that when we see transits of Saturn that things may become problematic. Going through the first house, it has a lot to do with health. It has a lot to do with just how the person goes through life and also personality. The other thing during this period of time is that she is in a 10th house perfection year. So the 10th house is having to do with your reputation, your career. It's like how the public views you. So at this point in time, we can tell that she was very much in the spotlight because I do believe that, what was it? It was season 13, her season 13 of her show premiered without her. So that was something that was very much in the public eye. And she also had Mars as her Time Lord. Now, natally, Mars is in her fifth house of children and recreation. So let's just keep that in mind for right now. Now, moving along to just a few months later, this is when things really start happening. And you can see that by February of 2022, and exactly on February 16th, Wells Fargo froze her bank accounts. Now, if you look at that outside ring, her progressed moon had just entered her 12th house. Now, the 12th house can be a house of losses. It's also, this is the end of a cycle. It's the end of a 12-year cycle after you've gone through houses, 1 through 11. The 12th house is usually a time of consolidation. It can be a time of mental health issues, going into institutions. A lot of times people are in the hospital. It's not always the person that's in the hospital. Sometimes they can be, taking care of someone or visiting someone a lot in a hospital. Oftentimes people can go on sabbatical. This is a good time to go on sabbatical, actually. But I found it remarkable that her progressed moon was at 0 degrees of Capricorn in her 12th house when this first event happened. The other thing is that transiting Saturn was exactly conjunct her ascendant. Now we're assuming that her birth chart, this is the exact time of her birth. I'm not sure if it is because it is a 9:30 time, but it is rated A. So it's probably pretty close because we see Saturn here exactly conjunct the ascendant. So Saturn can a lot of times be about restriction. It can represent somebody else taking control of you when it's conjuncting the ascendant. It can be a cutting down. It has to do with duties and responsibilities. So we can see how that can indicate something like a bank taking control of you and how you go through life. Saturn is also transiting exactly opposite her natal Mercury at this point in time. And why is that relevant? Well, Mercury rules her eighth house. The eighth house has to do with other people's money, but it also has to do with all sorts of finances and investments. So it can relate to your own trust fund. And at this point, or your own bank account. And at this point, the bank obviously took control of it. So Saturn opposite Mercury. So usually when you look at oppositions, you can think about it's often having to do with relationships, often having to do with another person. So you have Saturn, which is also, like a custodian or oftentimes even the government. But the Saturn is opposing her Mercury that is ruling her house related to her own saved up money, own trust, or things like that. Additionally, at this point, transiting Saturn on that middle ring is square her own Jupiter, which is in her fourth house. But Jupiter rules her second house of her own personal finances. So we have a double whammy here going on at the same time that the bank froze. Froze represents Saturn. So at the time that the bank froze her money, Saturn is contacting both planets that rule money in her chart. By March of 2022, a temporary financial guardian was assigned to her. And at that point, it's interesting because there was a double moon south node thing going on in her chart. You can see that her progressed moon was conjunct her natal south node in the 12th house, and the transiting south node was conjunct her natal moon in the 10th house. And so really, let's see, the moon rules her sixth house, having to do with health and work. So we can imagine that even while her progressed moon is in the 12th house, there is a drain and some loss, a spiritualization happening in terms of her health and her mindset. Also with her home, maybe she's losing things at that time having to do with home and just her mind. And again, we have Saturn conjunct her ascendant, and again, opposing Mercury and Jupiter, as we talked about before. And by the 19th of May 2022, a more permanent financial guardian was appointed, and it was only supposed to be appointed, I think, until July, until some other things were figured out. But at this point, we have Saturn square her natal moon. And again, so this can bring difficulties and hardship and, a really sort of a sense of depression and restriction in terms of how you go about doing things when you have Saturn contacting your moon in a square. And a lot of times it's things that are outside of your control when it's a square. So there's a conflict between her being able to maintain control over her own self and also her emotional reactions and habits in terms of how she's viewed in the world and how she gets through the world. The other thing, remember that Mars is the Time Lord for the year, because we're not yet to her birthday in 2022. Mars is transiting the second house. So that's one of the things that you can do when you're looking at perfection years, is you follow the transit of the Time Lord to find out which area of life might be highlighted at that point in time. So, with Mars in her second house, which relates to personal money, personal income, also your own values and self value. So, that's coming up at that time. Mars can cut things, and perhaps she was even maybe having to spend more money at this point because of Mars can burn through money. One thing to note that is also of interest is that there was a lunar eclipse that happened in her 10th house and 4th house. So the 10th house, again, having to do with public standing, and the 4th house having to do with home. Now, you'll recall that she was in a 10th house perfection year from 2021 until her birthday in 2022. So this is still effective. And so whenever you're looking at your perfected year, transits to that house are very important, and especially eclipses, which can be significant endings or beginnings or other types of stressors. But you can see here that that eclipse was exactly on her moon at 25 degrees of Scorpio. And it was also a south node eclipse, which is also often associated with losses or releases or spiritualization. So there would obviously be a loss in terms of public reputation because, she was disappearing from the public eye, and there were obviously probably changes having to do with home, which the moon represents. And at the same time, during that eclipse, Saturn, which again is her most challenging planet, was also square her moon and square Jupiter, controlling her money. So this is another reason why, you can pay attention to eclipses in your life. Although we can't always predict the outcome of eclipses because the energy is so chaotic, but this was probably influential in her life at that time. Now, there's not a lot of information that I found between that period and early 2024, but one of the things that did happen is that in September of 2022, her progressed Mars went into a new sign. It went into her 12th house in Leo. And so actually Mars improved a bit for her from going from Cancer into Leo. But whenever our progressed planets change signs, it can also bring a sense of instability to other things going on in our charts. And then by her birthday in July of 2023, she went into a 12th house year. So I've talked earlier about what the 12th house can bring. So while she's going into a 12th house year, which is the end of a long cycle, she's also has her progressed moon in the 12th house. So that brings an extra emphasis on the things having to do with the 12th house. So you can see the 12th house has to do with spirit. It is deeply spiritual. It has to do with secrets, sorrow, grief, escapism, seclusion, prison, mental illness. And then it's also a place where you can find your hidden strengths and weaknesses. So there was a lot of 12th house energy going on for Wendy over these past few years. So this is the period of time where Wendy Williams is pretty much missing. Nobody really knows where she is. She's not doing her show. Her show actually, I think, ended in 2022. Again, she's gone into the 12th house period in 2023. And let's see, by February 2024, it's revealed that she had been diagnosed with progressive aphasia and frontotemporal dementia. And they're saying that that diagnosis actually happened in 2023 when she actually went into that 12th house period. By also in February 2024, Lifetime releases Where is Wendy Williams documentary. That is very much a 12th house signature. Where is this person? Because a lot of times when people are in the 12th house, it's a very, very difficult time, and people may feel very alone, isolated, or like Wendy Williams, may be locked in an institution. Now, by May of 2024, you can see the progressed moon is still in her 12th house, but it is opposite her natal sun in the 6th house. So you may know that moon opposite sun is a full moon. So she's having a culmination of sorts at this period of time in May of 2024. And of course, things actually start picking up from here. We start hearing more about Wendy Williams and things start happening. But this was sort of probably just the beginning of that. The other very significant thing that happened around that time was that Saturn, her progressed Saturn, changed signs. And this is a very, let's say, this is something that is very unusual to happen. Not everyone has Saturn change by progression during their lifetime. But for Wendy Williams, this changed from Pisces into Aquarius. So in some sense, Saturn, which is actually her ascendant ruler, Saturn actually represents Wendy. Saturn has improved a bit in terms of dignity, even though it's still her most difficult planet. Now, the question for me is, does Saturn moving from her second house of income and value into her first house, where we already know Saturn was transiting when she was put into guardianship, Saturn was already transiting her first house. So does the progressed Saturn moving into her first house mean that she's going to remain under guardianship, outside guardianship, or is this more of the energy of she is able to take more responsibility for her own self? Also because Saturn is in domicile in Aquarius, but she may sort of end up being just sort of a more responsible, maybe even more reserved type person with Saturn in the first house. But that's another interesting change. I told you before, Mars changed signs by progression. Saturn is changing signs by progression. Both malefic, difficult planets changing by progression can shake up your life. So whenever you see a planet changing signs by progression, there are bound to be lots of difficulties, changes in the life. By the time we get to August 22nd, 2024, you can see that the progressed moon has now exited the 12th house. And this is also when you start again seeing more and more interest in Wendy Williams, where she is. I know that I saw on social media more people questioning about where she was. So the progressed moon comes into the first house, and I'm not sure when she started getting more clarity, or, you know, when people started seeing that she had more clarity, but it could have kind of started happening around that time. The other thing that happened was that Pluto finally transited, for the last time into the first house. So it may be that there is more of transformation in herself and how she presents to the world, and feeling more empowered herself with Pluto transiting that house. And over the next 20 years, by the end of this next 20-year period, she will be a totally changed person. And anybody who has Aquarius in the first house will experience the same thing. So now the progressed moon going into the first house could be more freedom for her, but in any event, it'll be more of a focus on who she is, her own personality, how she wants to go through life. And so it'll be interesting to see how things progress with the progressed moon in the first house. On January 18th of 2025, we have the Breakfast Club interview with Wendy coming out. Now, one of the interesting things about this is that we're hearing more about her money and how she is actually more coherent, and I think she's done a filing that so that she can maybe get control back over her own finances. So what's happened during that period of time is, you can see on the middle ring that the North Node has entered her second house of personal finances. And then the South Node is transiting her 8th house of shared finances. And remember those accounts that I'm talking about, taxes, all of that kind of thing. So with the South Node going there, it could be that there is a dissolution of whoever is controlling her trust or her accounts, and that there's an activation in terms of her own personal finances. Saturn is still transiting her 2nd house, so there still may be regulation over that until maybe Saturn goes into the 3rd house. And Neptune is also still in the 2nd house. So perhaps by 2026, when Saturn and Neptune have moved out of her 2nd house, some of these things can be settled. And then finally, what's coming up? Well, on March 14th, 2025, there will be a lunar eclipse in Virgo. And that's happening again in her 8th house and 2nd house, having to do with finances. And I believe by this time she is in a 1st house perfection year. So Saturn is in her 2nd house of money. So there's a lot of emphasis on her own personal money right now, with the North Node transiting there, and also with Saturn transiting there, which is the Time Lord for the year. So there can be possibly a consolidation or, restrictions still concerning her finances, but it can also be that she can now take control over her own finances, or have someone else controlling it who is more beneficial for her than what's been going on with her before. And with the lunar eclipse, which is a culmination on the South Node in her 8th house, it can be the end of whatever arrangements have been going on with her investments and her trust and all of that, until this point. The other thing that we see is that her progressed moon with that eclipse at 7 degrees of Aquarius is going to be square her MC and her IC. So that to me indicates that what happens with the progressed moon is that it activates points as it goes around the chart. So it would be activating her public standing and activating her home. So who knows, like maybe this can be a change for how she's seen in the public and what she's doing at home. Her IC is in her 5th house, so it may have a lot to do with her child or her children. And that's the other thing, is that Mercury represents her children and her investments, and there's a lot of activity going on with her Mercury, and so there may be more coming up with that in terms of her and her child and her home situation. So those were some of the things that I noticed about the difficult transits that Wendy Williams has been going through. Not just transits, but mostly a lot of progressions. And I really like to look at the secondary progressions because they can really show you kind of what period you're going through or what types of activations are going to happen. And I've found them pretty reliable. Not every progression or not every transit is going to show up, but in this case, it is remarkable that some of the most difficult transits and progressions have been going on for Wendy Williams over the past few years, and that now that some of them are subsiding, it looks like she's kind of coming out of that really low point. So let me know if you have any questions or if you want me to talk about anything else related to this, and I will talk to you soon.